DIF. And yeah, I'll walk you through the basics of like how we got started. We launched in January, and yeah. So the title is So You Want to Start a Canadian Pro-Publica? And that's because we were very based off of Pro-Publica. We're most succinctly described as Canada's Pro-Publica. We've been heavily inspired by them. Yeah, so given the audience, I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but for those who don't know, Pro-Publica is an independent, non-profit media outlet focused on investigative journalism and based in the United States. They maintain several databases that provide valuable information to the public. Zane, our founder, saw a market opportunity because he saw that there was nothing similar in Canada, and so he started up DIJF. Yeah, we aim to strengthen Canadian democracy by focusing exclusively on investigative journalism and collecting or providing valuable data to the public in an accessible manner. So first I'll talk about our data pipeline. Yeah, so our basic process is scraping, cleaning, and ingesting data. So yeah, I actually didn't do much of the work on the current pipeline because I joined a year after everyone else, but I'll do my best to explain, and one of my colleagues is in the audience if you have any very specific questions. Yeah, so a lot of our data comes from the government and is freely available. We scrape this data. Some of the data in donations and charities is stuff that only we have. We got like a dump from the CRA, and some websites no longer post old data, and so yeah, we're the only source for some of our data, but yeah, for the most part, we scrape our data from government sources. Yeah, so we scrape from federal and provincial registries for the most part, and then we clean and ingest that data into a single database. This makes comparisons and analysis between regions or across the country a lot simpler and possible. In order to do that, we start by creating a schema that properly captures all of the attributes from each of the sources. This involves assessing what should or shouldn't be scraped, coming up with appropriate column names that capture the essence of the attributes between regions, grouping the data into appropriate tables, and defining the relationships between said tables. The relationships between tables are heavily dependent on primary keys. This is usually some combination of registration number, year or date, and region. It's necessary to have these primary keys because our data is in several tables, and in order to join the tables together, you need a key. And yeah, some of the smaller like provincial registries use like really simple numbering methods, and so if we didn't create some sort of primary key, there'd be overlap between registrations, and yeah, we need like unique identifiers. Usually fitting a region into the schema is relatively simple, as the attributes tend to be analogous between regions. For example, a donation pretty much anywhere contains the attributes donee, recipient, and party. But sometimes the structure of a specific region's data does not match up with the rest, and so requires a bit more work. An example of this is in the Quebec lobbying registry. In most regions, lobbying registrations contain lobbyists, whereas in Quebec, lobbyists are the top-level entity, which contain individual registrations. So we had to come up with a different method of crawling and parsing Quebec lobbying data in order to fit that into our system. Yeah, our current scraping setup is written in Python and heavily relies on Selenium. Selenium is an open source framework that enables you to interact with the web browsers programmatically. This means you can use code to click buttons and navigate through pages, as well as extract data from specific elements. Selenium is entirely dependent on using a browser to load web pages. from which the data is scraped. This is resource intensive and thus slower and more expensive than is always necessary. We've started working on a new scraping pipeline that is much less dependent on the browser and Selenium, and I'll talk about this a bit later. Most of our cleaning work involves renaming columns, formatting dates, fixing capitalization, removing spaces, splitting strings between columns, converting strings into the correct data type, replacing known text errors, such as a political party's name being misspelled, deduplicating, and creating the primary keys so that separate tables can be joined together. Once the data is cleaned, it's ingested. The ingestion step mostly checks that the required columns and data are in place, and also whether or not the data already exists in the database. Since we scrape daily, there can sometimes be a bit of an overlap, and so we check if the data exists already before ingesting or updating it. Our scrapers run daily. They're scheduled using cron tab and can be called manually when necessary via the command line, using a couple of specific flags. So next, I'll talk about our front end, basically, the user-facing databases. Yeah, so I did most of the work on the front end. Once we had our working databases on the back end late last year, we had to make some decisions about what would actually be available to our users. Yeah, so in a couple slides before, you saw in donations that there was like a lot of column names, and only like a very small selection of those are actually available to users. Yeah, so our current publicly available data covers 3 topics: donations, lobbying, and charities, and is split into 8 different user-facing databases. On the back end, there are many more tables. The publicly available data draws from views that are refreshed daily, materialized views that are refreshed daily after the ingestion of the newly scraped data. The views join together several tables and in some cases deduplicate the rows shown. They're necessary because it's really hard to get a good idea of what the data is saying if you can't see it all together. And so, yeah, joining them is necessary, and it's what the front end draws from. So for example, in charities, all the financial data is in separate tables, and in order to get a full view of what the charity is up to, we draw from the materialized view instead. Similarly, in revolving door, the view removes duplicates that happen when a given lobbyist appears in several registrations because they represent different clients. Our front end is built using Next.js, and our back end is heavily reliant on Supabase and Amazon Web Services. Supabase is like a new sort of platform. It acts as it's like back end as a service. It handles our databases, APIs, and authentication, and it greatly simplified our stack. Prior to this, we were going to go with Amazon for databases, Hasura for APIs, and Firebase for authentication. But yeah, Supabase greatly simplified this and cut down on cost and time, and I'd recommend. It was my first time using it, and I'd recommend for sure. Yeah, when designing the front end of the databases, I basically was given pretty free reign, and so for some of the data, I found it best to be put in just like normal tables, and then for other ones, I came up with more of like a search page format where you get like an index page that you can search, and then you can click through into a more detailed view. For data visualizations within stories, generally the author makes them themselves using Flourish or Data Wrapper. Our editorial team does all of their own analysis on the data, which is then checked for accuracy by other members of the team. Some of the data in our stories is not from our user-facing databases at all. For example, Hannah's work on student visas comes from data that she asked for and got, and yeah, that we don't display publicly. It's not in any of these 8 databases. Next, I'll talk about our alert system. Yeah, so our paying subscribers have the option to set a couple of keywords that they can then get email alerts for. I built this using Postgres triggers and functions, as well as Amazon's Lambda and simple email services. And basically, yeah, it involves Postgres triggers, which trigger functions that check the data for matches. Matches are added to a table, and then a Lambda function checks that table, looks up the matches using the data within that first lookup, and then sends an email to our subscribers. And lastly, I'll talk about our future. So yeah, in the future, we're currently working on our new pipeline, which should be a lot faster and cheaper. So instead of using Selenium, which relies on the browser a lot, our new system will rely more on curl requests. Curl is a simple Unix command line tool used for making requests to web servers and retrieving data from URLs. It's extremely fast and lightweight. And a curl request returns the raw HTML of a given page, which we can then parse for the required data. It isn't always possible to escape using the browser. Sometimes it is necessary, but by cutting down on its use, we expect to be able to scrape at much faster rates and at a fraction of the cost. We also plan to introduce some new data sets. The most sure one is disclosures data set, which will involve the stocks, real estate, and other financial assets owned by politicians at the federal level and in every province and territory. We've also talked about databases for government procurements, the Sunshine List, and many other things. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. Any questions?
Yeah. So how many of your databases are open to the public? I guess what's the difference between the paid
yeah, so all of them are public to some degree. A paid subscription usually gets you access to more columns or like more of a date range. So some we restrict to like the past 5 years for the public, and then if you have a paid subscription, you can get access to like our entire history. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.